The panel that we've pulled together today, we've asked to come and share their work in progress, their thinking, and to hold a conversation amongst themselves, asking themselves, being asked, the questions we don't have the answers to. When Amory and I and a number of others of you go out on the road to give a speech, we know what we're going to say. We've said it 100 times before. We know what 90% of the questions we're going to get asked are, and we know the answers to them. It really is more in the way of entertainment. There's not a whole lot of new thinking going on. We did not ask people to come here today and give prepared speeches. This is not a conference in the normal sense. We asked them to come and stretch intellectually, to try to come up with the answers that none of us have. And maybe by the interaction of all of us, we can get further than we are right now. Dennis, what happens if we do nothing? If we just muddle along? The world's muddled along for millennia, and we're still here, and it's still here. What happens if we don't change?
If you perpetuate out the policies which we've seen over the last 20 years for another 20 years, then we conclude it's too late to avoid global collapse.
What does collapse look like?
Well, collapse, I think a good way to understand it is that some of the positive loops which have sustained growth in material well-being in many regions of the world turn around and start perpetuating decline, because a positive loop can operate in either direction, to sustain growth or to sustain decline. And some of the key positive loops we've seen operating to our benefit in the past have been, as Amory pointed out, in the economy, where greater production gives you more investable resources, which lets you accumulate more capital, that lets you have even more production. Collapse is when something like Hazel Henderson calls the entropy state, that you spend so much of your capital dealing with the consequences of past production that you don't have enough left over to sustain the real productive capacity of the society. And as a consequence of that, your capital plant begins to dissipate, often at an accelerating rate. Same thing with the renewable resource base, that you don't sustain its productivity anymore, but because it starts to get more and more scarce, declining food per capita, production per capita, you use it so intensively that you deteriorate it even more quickly. So what if we don't do anything? Well, trends which we see around the world already will accelerate. Western Europe, Japan, maybe the United States will be able to resist and obscure those trends within their own regions for another 10 or 15 years until the global issues like climate change and ozone depletion and so forth begin to impact also here. There's two kinds of global problems: those you can buy your way out of and those you can't. You can buy your way out of hunger because you can import food from Central America, but you can't buy your way out of ozone depletion. There's no way we can spend a little money and push all the harmful consequences of ozone depletion or climate change off on the poorer countries. And those things are only about 2 decades from starting to have a very significant influence here.
Is growth the problem, the solution? And any of you jump in on this.
Well, a brief response to that, of course, is that in itself, when we talk about growth, we mean physical flows, and that's not the key issue here. The issue is the quality of life that we can sustain on the basis of those flows. So a declining growth could be a period of declining growth could be a wonderful period for us. That's not the way it's currently operating, because we haven't put in place the mechanisms, the political and economic mechanisms to decouple quality of life from physical flow. So the areas where you see a declining use of materials, declining use of food and so forth are generally areas where the quality of life is also going down.
These issues, I think we've known a great deal about these things for a long, long time. And I'm particularly struck with the power of denial that there is in contemporary society. And we have an expert on the panel, Claudine Schneider, not in denial, but in politics. She happens to be a good Republican. Both words bear some note. I'd like to ask a question of Claudine. I mean, given the dire scenario in all of this, and it's not a problem we don't have enough information. We have lots of information. We have lots of information about global warming, about acid rain, and about ozone depletion. We're buried in data and information. And yet it doesn't play out there in the public somehow, some way. So I'd like to ask Claudine very quickly what to do about it.
We all innately have a responsibility to leave this planet better than we found it. And one of those avenues that carries an enormous amount of weight is the political avenue, in addition to the media and press and communications end of things. And so I think that as we are looking at a time now of revolution, and I believe we are, and I think that the revolution taking place right now in the United States is going to be comparable to what has happened in the Soviet Union. But we're failing, once again, as David has said, we're going through an enormous stage of denial. What we need to do is to break down those barriers of denial and to communicate that we are all in this together, we all have a personal responsibility, and that responsibility many times is going to have to carry us into the political realm or carry us into the written and spoken word in the broad media.
That raises an interesting question, which is how does big change occur in society? David, you were saying last night that, 1916, Lenin said he never lived to see the revolution. Who of us a couple of years back would have thought the Berlin Wall would have come down, or whatever would have happened? Great, you're bright. I wouldn't have. I just took the communist empire as something that was going to endure basically forever. It all of a sudden delegitimized very quickly. Much more quickly than even the folk that were trying to get it to happen were prepared to deal with. As a result of which, not very many people over there or over here have a clue what to do about it. Something happened dramatically in world history, and we just sort of sat here and said, oh, what causes delegitimization? The Copernican revolution, the abolition of slavery, the development of the theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, these are all radical transitions in human thought, human philosophy, human political organization. What causes delegitimization, and how can you foster it? Do you have to wait till it happens? Is it a teachable moment that you have to be able to grab? How do you get prepared for it?
Yes.
Go ahead, David. Then Robert.
Well, it seems to me if you had gone back, the year, 1750 or whenever, and said, let's go out and watch the Enlightenment happening. It was happening all around them. And it was the encyclopedists, sending letters back and forth, and it was Montesquieu writing the Spirit of the Laws, and it was Tom Jefferson in a little room in Philadelphia penning what became the Declaration of Independence. I think there's an ecological enlightenment going on around us. And I think it's all around us. I think it's all around the earth. I think the Rio Conference was testimony to this. But the fact that that enlightenment is taking place is not a guarantee that it will proceed to a conclusion we would want. Right. And so all the trends that Dennis described at the outset, I think are true and are scary, and I think we ought to run scared. But last night we were talking about the Lenin in 1916, his comment that he would never live to see the revolution. Lo and behold, a year later, there he is. And if we
Again, without a clue how to run it.
Yes, and he was in many ways a victim of the failure of a dialogue that began with Proudhon and Marx and so forth. That dialogue did not produce the results it should have produced. When Lenin came to power, he was not armed with ideas that were humane or the ideas of the limits of power or the limits of organization. And the Soviet Union and the whole world has paid an enormous price for a failure of thinking. And that's why I think while the Enlightenment's going on and RMI has been right at the center of it, I think we ought to run scared. And for reasons that, Hunter, you just alluded to, that sometimes moments pass, historical opportunity passes, and so forth. And I think this is a good decade to make major advances in this process of enlightenment. But if we don't make major advances in this decade, I think the likelihood of a non-traumatic transition begins to decline markedly and declines rapidly every decade thereafter. So I think that, Hunter, you said it very well. I think there's a moment that we have to seize, and the second decade of RMI, and I hate to put all this on RMI, but you guys
Come on, y'all, you got to help us.
save the world and save our souls in the process.
Innovation always starts off as a minority activity. It's almost by definition it happens that way. Therefore, it's valuable to try to identify what the long-term trends are, at least not so much in a predictive sense of what will happen, but that if we were to get to a future that we would want to get to, what are the trends that are moving in that direction? And then try to build as much of the furniture as we can right now. My impression of looking at the things that historians call revolutions, like what happened in 1917, is that there's so much chaos going on that it's really like rearranging the furniture in the living room, and a couple of pieces are taken out, and there were some pieces that were out in the garage that get moved in. But if you look at the difference between the Tsarist secret police and the KGB, there's not a big difference, because those were the cultural models that they had available to them. The real place where the true cultural change gets built is in building the furniture that gets to sit around in the garage until the moment is right.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
What we need to be doing now is, in order to run scared, is that we need to be building like hell so that we've got the furniture in the garage so that as those, to some extent, unpredictable exact moments, but we can predict that the moment is going to be coming.
I think part of it's a failure of belief. I mean, like Lennon said, he never lived to see the revolution. It's sort of in my darkest moments, I think I'm never going to live to see any significant change, and yet it could happen. I mean, it does happen awfully damn quick when it goes.
It already has happened. I mean,
Yeah, sorry you missed it.
You mean I can still drive my pickup truck?
Yeah, I mean, just to be specific, the past dozen years, this country got 7 times as much new energy, 4.5 times as much new energy from savings as from net increases in supply. A third of the new supply was renewables. And all the zillions of tiny little things that all of you did with caulk guns and duct tapes and so on since '73 are now giving the country each year 2/5 more energy than the entire domestic oil industry.
Yeah, that's part
a
of
big
my
deal.
speech too.
Yeah.
And all of those are hopeful indicators. On the other hand, that by itself is not going to address the global warming problem. Massive changes are yet needed.
I think they're happening. See, Abba Eban said that people and nations behave wisely once they've exhausted all other alternatives. And I think we're really getting pretty close to the bottom of the list. I was just with Amory Lovins, who was saying this is a very propitious moment to advance modern energy efficiency ideas in developing countries. Many of them are coming to that on their own, and even the World Bank is starting to do so, because there isn't the money to do anything else. It'll take 8 or 10 times as much capital as exists to keep the lights on by building power plants. So they really can't afford the supply side traditional approach anymore. So just by default, they're driven to what they should have been doing all along. And I think we can see a lot of fields where that's going on.
one of the really big barriers to innovation and change that will be thrown up in our face during this decade is the scarcity of capital. We're in a period now which will extend at least until the end of this decade and maybe further, where a long-wave Kondratiev cycle, which produces these depressions every 50 years or so, coincides with a historic shift over towards our having to internalize the cost of environmental capital, which used to be free. And the combined effect of that means that the growth capacity of the capital stock is extremely much lower than it used to be. And It's why our capital plant is deteriorating in this country for the moment, our educational capital plant, our municipal infrastructure, and so forth. When we propose new ideas, the people who think about responding to them in the old way will say they can't afford it. And here I think RMI has an extraordinarily powerful weapon, because as you can show that less capital is required to achieve your purposes in a new way, that is going to have a kind of compelling logic that it didn't used to have. Because not only the United States, but all of the Western economies, Japan included, are now moving into a period of severe capital scarcity. And the recognition of that is dawning on people now with a real force.
Amory, real quick reply to Dennis.
Yeah, it's not only that our demand-side efficiency-based solutions cost a lot less, they're also much faster. They're short lead time, fast payback, so you enormously increase the velocity of the capital loop and therefore can do a lot more with less working capital. And we're finding in many developing countries now at the highest level a strong interest in electric efficiency in particular as a capital amplifier, because a quarter of global development capital goes to electrification. And that's the money not going to female literacy, infant immunization, clean water, and so on, all the development basics. I want, though, to add a cautionary note about how you build the furniture. It takes a lot of attention to detail. God is in the details. I mean, we just showed, for example, in a report that's in the resource room, that about $1 trillion has been wasted in the United States on poorly designed and unnecessary cooling systems in buildings and power supplies to run them. That is, our buildings are using 10 times as much energy as they should for cooling. They're less comfortable, they're costing more to build. And that's tying up unnecessarily 2/5 of the generating capacity in the country. Now, why did we do that? Because there are about 24 parties, all of whom speak different languages, who create, occupy, and run buildings, and they all have perfectly perverse incentives. They're rewarded for inefficient behavior, they're penalized for efficient behavior. As a small example, engineers who do a great job designing mechanical systems see lower fees and profits because the systems are smaller and they have to work harder. Engineers who do a sloppy job of obsolete rules of thumb and lookups and catalogs specify costlier systems, their fees go up, their profits go up because they aren't working as much. So there are ways to fix that. For example, you can have utilities earmark part of their hardware rebates to go directly to the designers according to how much they save. And we're considering now in our energy program spending a substantial part of the next decade looking for those little trim tab factors whereby slightly changing institutional incentives with existing structures, you can use people's existing motives and skills to produce the right result. But we need a much more comprehensive catalog of where those opportunities are and which ones to devote our limited resources to.
David.
On that point, and a little bit more simply, Amory made a visit to Oberlin College in February of this past year. And one of the things that came out of that was an interesting note about how to tie institutional incentives to saving. It turned out that the treasurer at Oberlin College, in managing Oberlin's $250 million endowment, is paid a commission. His idea of managing the endowment is to mail a check to a New York financial house and so forth, and if the rate of return goes up to a certain point, he gets a commission, goes higher, he gets a higher commission, and so forth. But he is given, and I think this is probably true elsewhere, he's given no opportunity to save on the input side of the institution. It's a very simple little trim tab factor. If the college were to say to him, and I think this would be true with most institutions of higher education, we'll pay you, your hardest greed, we'll pay you a commission. And you can save money anywhere in the institution you want, on the outgo side, on the investment side, or you can take some of that investment and invest it in the institution. And in the case of Oberlin, according to Amory's numbers, he could get a rate of return that would be roughly, considerably higher than in his wettest financial dreams. Rates of return at 50 or 60% or whatever, and yet that very simple thing, he doesn't profit in doing that right now.
Yeah, so you go to the controller and say, boy, have we got a deal for you, fix up your lights, 50% tax-free, risk-free, And we just need to find a mechanism to let some of the portfolio money get invested in that on-campus saving.
Many of the people that I've been dealing with over the last 10 years, if I tried to promote an environmental idea, it didn't fly. I will tell you the reason that I was successful with our team of people to stop the Clinch River breeder reactor was not on proliferation, it was not on environmental impact, it was on the economics, that this was a piece of pork that cost $8 billion and started off going to cost $400 million. So I perceived the process of what makes people tick and concluded that it was money, it was economics that was talking. So I thought, if I'm going to reach those people that are in those positions that I really want to change, those corporate CEOs, those senators, those congressmen, I am going to speak their language of economics to them. So what we've put together is the product value of biodiversity, not only pharmaceuticals, but also ecosystem value, which most people don't know what is ecosystem value. So I want to try to take this economic and scientific language and put it in very common terms that somebody reading Reader's Digest would be able to understand easily. And one ad that I came up with recently, and so what we're doing is we've done the research. It's focused only on the United States because everyone is sensitive to the loss of biodiversity around the world, but at the same time we're looking over there and we're trying to tell people not to burn their rainforest, and here we're filling in our wetlands, we're cutting down our ancient forest, we're totally ignoring all of the loss of biodiversity that we have control over in this country. So we're taking kernels of this information from the research, and I am trying to figure out how to match it with different corporations. And then I am going to these corporate CEOs and saying, here's a message. And what I am answering subliminally, as that corporate leader is sitting there, is he's saying, what's in it for me? When we can answer the question, what's in it for me, we've taken a major step forward.
We're always looking for ways to introduce new feedbacks or change existing ones so as to reward rather than penalize efficient behavior. I think that's a good generic principle because these are dynamic organizations that have their own reasons for doing things, and if you can just reward them for doing the right thing, you can use their metabolism to do what's necessary.
Amory, say a little bit more about that.
Well, the utility regulatory reform is the most obvious. I mean, here you have, let's see, John Fox, you're in the audience. Where's John?
I think he left.
Who's on both our boards, who runs the world's largest demand-side management program, and last year spent, I think, $170-some million helping customers buy less electricity and more efficiency. And that generated something like $300 or $400 million in customer benefit, and then the company got to keep about 15% of that, so it added 40-odd million to their bottom line. You can be quite sure if you run a program like that, the utility CEO is likely to call you every week and say, is there anything you need? And all the smartest people in the company will want to work in your division. Now, I think it's also important to look for demand pull in complex market relationships rather than to push people into doing things. So if you want to get more efficient buildings built, it's not enough just to educate developers or just to, say, improve engineering education. I think you need to change incentives so that key parties who have a lot of influence start demanding efficient buildings. For example, maybe the financiers will demand it to get their financial performance. Maybe we should be marketing energy efficiency to the insurance companies that own a lot of non-performing real estate and want to make it, want to get tenants in and get more net operating income. We can market to the tenants that they'll have less occupancy costs and better productivity and better comfort and better light and so on. Their demands for better buildings will then converge on the asset managers and building owners, who will then need to find design professionals who can tell them how to do it. So we need to educate them too. But I think those are the main kinds of actors. And very often in RMI, we've been able to use existing competitive forces to do our outreach for us. For example, in soft commercial leasing markets, which is most of them, people fight over rent differences of 5 or 10 cents a square foot year. But a lighting retrofit saves you about $1 per square foot year. Whoever does that first has money they can use to do initial rent concessions or tenant finish or whatever it takes to grab tenants. And whoever does it first, therefore, will gain market shares. Meanwhile, you have a lot of architects and engineers twiddling their thumbs because nobody's building stuff. So retrofit for them is the only game in town. They have a strong market incentive to get good at it and to hire themselves out to the developers who are fixing up those non-performing properties. So we always look for those kinds of opportunities where there's a silver lining, namely people have an economic incentive to do what we're talking about. And the third business idea I'd suggest is looking for unexpected allies. Last year, we were approached by the Copper Development Corporation, which is the vertically integrated organization of everybody from the copper mining companies through all the copper and brass fabricators, all the way to the recyclers. This is kind of ironic because it's a fight with the world's largest mining company over a copper mine that got me into this business in the first place. Well, we had stupidly failed to notice that just about all the things you do to save electricity use more copper. Fatter wire, bigger pipe, more and better copper in the motors, bigger heat exchangers, and so on. So people who are marketing copper have a very strong incentive to push electric efficiency. For their own marketing reasons, they are now turning into very powerful, imaginative allies in promoting electric efficiency. And then they will also help pick up the lousy motors and get the copper recycled again, so they'll work with our utility partners. Now, that makes me wonder how many of those opportunities have we missed by not having systematically thought through whose interest is it in to do what we're talking about, and how can we create a partnership with them that neither of us thought of.
Robert Reich writes that we should forget the idea of a national economy. There isn't such a thing anymore. And in the new era of capitalism, we have to face up to the fact that we're in a global economy. And yet we keep hearing the problems of GATT and the problems of the free trade, North American Free Trade Agreement. When we have the global economy and we take the jobs out of the country, then people here don't have jobs. And you can't, if you don't have a place for people to work, retraining people is kind of hollow. It just seems to me that it's really a difficult thing to decide what kind of economy we have. Herman Daly talks about the need to have a national economy again. So I guess I'm coming up with a lot of questions on how to connect all this in really addressing the security of people. How can we deal with the excess of wealth that many people have because we've accepted a global economy, and try to bring ourselves maybe, if not to local economies, to some agreement about what a national economy is?
It seems we've increasingly impoverished our world, and no place more glaringly than in the way we conduct commerce and in the way we earn our livelihoods. It seems while our computer imagination has gone out like this, our sense of how we run an economy has begun to shrunk like this. That's why I think Thomas's book is so important in this sense. It's asking a whole range of other kinds of questions. And I think communities ought to get together and ask, look, do we want a Walmart? And yeah, I can buy my tires and my toothpaste cheaper at Walmart, but I pay a price. And this is what I think comes down to the difference between price and cost. And price is what you pay at the checkout counter, and cost, which we're not nearly as good at assessing. Cost is the total range of things that we pay. And that's paid in healthcare, deterioration of community, it's crime, it's all the rest. I think that's but we don't yet have institutions that can conduct a dialogue about whether Walmarts ought to come in to our towns and villages. Do you shop at Walmart? This is time for confessions. Do you shop at Walmart yet?
You know, I agree with you. I think, though, that that's something we have to face, that communities don't get together and discuss whether they want a Walmart or not. Everyone assumes that the individual does want the lowest price for any product. And if money is saved, then that means the consumer can buy 2 more products. And that's the way things are run. So what do you do to get communities to want to come together to talk about the real cost instead of the price? And it's not just a matter of television education. It's not a matter of making the elementary school kids go out and learn about frogs on a pond. I mean, this process of educating for a sustainable society is at all levels, and I don't think we've come up with the right level yet to help a community learn how to talk about cost.
I want to describe that in the community that I'm part of, the larger community of Bainbridge Island, which is a population of about 18,000 people on an island, that not Walmart, but the subject of Safeway and McDonald's and these other things, did get a lot of discussion. We were not able to stop them. But the reason that I bring this up is just that it struck me how wonderful it was that we had this band of water around us that enabled us to have a geographic sense of who we were. And I think that the loss of that, the sprawling quality that communities have taken on, make it very difficult for that sort of conversation to go on in most communities. Because people don't know what community they belong to.
It seems, I think a lot of you, and maybe I'm just projecting my own concerns here, we're facing, it seems to me, a major issue and a major trend, set of forces that I'm not sure any of us could imagine turning around in the continent-wide nation state that we created here. We set up constitutional barriers so that communities could not block the flow of capital and could not block the flow of people. And that's playing itself out in ways that increasingly don't look very attractive. In the Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, we had to watch what the mobility of capital meant as hostile takeover efforts in the 70s and 80s forced companies that had nurtured and protected their natural capital in the form of old growth timber and had been harvesting in a very modest, moderate way, faced with the attempt to make that capital mobile via hostile takeover, the forests got stripped. In order to, either they got taken over, financed by junk bonds, so the trees had to be stripped to pay off the junk bonds, or to keep from being taken over, companies had to increase their cash flow, increase the value of their stock, and also had to strip away the trees. You know, a good example to me of how destructive mobile capital in an unconstrained market can be. Now the situation we face is not only having that take place on a nationwide level, we're talking about the equivalent of a global market economy with capital moving in that way, same sort of way, and the same sort of leveling. It's both frightening to me, I think to any environmentally sensitive person, but it's also debilitating in the sense that I have not the foggiest idea as to how not only to limit that on a global level, but how to sort of move backwards to a point where we can protect communities better within the constitutional structure we have here. I think a lot of imagination needs to go into either saying, okay, we're going to have this mobility. In the context of this mobility, this world market, how can we protect community, environmental resources? Are there other mechanisms we can overlay on that? Or alternatively, how can we organize to stop what seems to be the thrust of the 80s and now going into the next century to globalize everything?
And particularly when national accounts and even quite often corporate accounts don't properly account for capital depletion. You know, Hicks defined income as the maximum amount you can consume over a given period without being worse off than when you started. So it expressly excludes capital consumption. And yet, in our national accounts, if we mine something or cut a tree or whatever, we count the proceeds of the sale as income, and we don't count the loss of the asset on any kind of national balance sheet. It's assumed to be just the cost of extraction and not the cost of replacement that matters.
What are we going to do about all of this? Specifically, let's run through some institutions. We've talked a bit about education. Anybody got any bright ideas about how we're going to change the educational institutions?
Several years ago, 5 years ago to be exact, we did a study of the food systems of 4 colleges around the country. And the typical food flows from these institutions were absolutely bizarre. There was an Arkansas college buying its beef from Amarillo, Texas. The beef, part of which was slaughtered in Chicago, most of it was packaged in St. Louis. Then it made the journey down to Little Rock by truck, and then over to Conway, Arkansas, where it was eaten. And this is curious for several reasons. One is that, just a little irony, that the feeder steers that were fattened in Amarillo were born in Arkansas. It's closed loop kind of thing. Turned out that, of course, when you get the metaphor of something wrong, the mistakes kind of ramify through the system. So it turned out that when you confinement feed animals, you had to pump them full of antibiotics. So the beef that showed up on tables at Hendrix College was laced with all kinds of chemical additives and so forth, which was somewhat in undermining the college wellness policy. It turned out also that ranchers in the local area, and you could stand at the edge of the college campus literally and throw a rock and hit a cow. The local slaughterhouse was going broke. Now, it turned out that in trying to rethink this, we had organized students to do the research, so this becomes curriculum. Begin to look at resource flows as curriculum and acquire the kind of tools and language of least cost end-use analysis and systems thinking and so forth. But it turned out that the college could buy its beef locally and save money. They could buy it organically and be in harmony with a wellness policy. They could improve the quality of the meat that they serve. They were having to add fat imported from Iowa to beef raised in Amarillo, slaughtered in Chicago, and so forth. So it was a win-win thing all the way around. And when we began to extend this idea to look at the way institutions bought other things, and also making this curriculum, so the way the institution works becomes part of the curriculum. One last illustration of this, John Todd, who's one of the pioneers in ecological engineering, has designed a waste treatment facility for a school in Toronto. And what this does, we think of flush, gone. And of course, it's not gone. So John built what he calls a living machine, which is a series of translucent tanks into which human waste goes. Built this as a sort of a centerpiece at the school. Now, it's flush and, hey, that's... Now, what's going on here is a good lesson. It's a way in which redesigning our buildings can become pedagogical. And so we begin to teach closed-loop systems, solutions, possibilities for ecological engineering, and other kinds of things. So I'd like to suggest that one of the things that we might talk about, and RMI might look at in the future in its next decade, would be institutional design, embodying these kinds of ideas within institutional structures. And I think when this happens, it will create the kind of win-win situations that make good change easy and possible.
I'm reminded of a story, I'm told it's true, about how the poet Gary Snyder ended the war in Vietnam. It seems that in the 60s he was sitting in a bar in Tokyo and an American walked in and they got to talking, both of them being a long way from home. Gary asked the American what he was doing, and he said he was on his way to Saigon to do a study of the Vietnam War. And he asked Gary what he thought of the war. Gary said he didn't think much of it. He thought it was a bad idea. American was amazed. He hadn't heard that point of view before, working for the U.S. government. And they got to talking about what matters and values and poetry, things like that. the American stayed up all night and delayed his flight a couple of days to stay talking to Gary. Gary's an amazing guy if you ever get to talk to him. And then he went on to Saigon, and Gary didn't think much more of it. Gary lived in Tokyo for a while and moved back to the Sierras and lived in one place and moved and lived in another place and moved. Then he heard that, through the grapevine, that some guy on a motorcycle was looking for him. He'd been to one of the places he'd lived, and the neighbors had sent him forward, but he wasn't there, so he sent word forward. I'm the guy you met in that bar in Tokyo. That conversation changed my life. Watch your newspapers. 2 weeks later, the Pentagon Papers story broke. The guy was Dan Ellsberg. Sometimes it matters who you talk to, and it matters a lot that you talk. And sometimes it changes the world. Thank you all very much for having been here and having helped all of us. This is not the end of this process. All of us, just by being here, you've shown that you care about this and you're involved with sustainability. At Rocky Mountain Institute, we're going to be continuing this process and redefining what we're going to be doing for the next decade. We're just a postage stamp away, so if any of you have any bright ideas, please jot them down and send them to us, or send them to your own favorite local group, or start your own group so that 10 years from now I can come to your celebration. Thank you, and let's have a party.